Hello and most welcome to 1224 of the series. And I will continue with Constructivism and Mathematics Education as the previous 3 lectures. And I finished off with Bloor. Bloor's highly illuminating discussion of objectivity takes the issue to the heart of mathematics. What we mean by the existence of mathematical objects. Indeed, he takes the views on Frege, one of the major figures in presenting the Neoplatonist image of mathematics. To illustrate the social nature of mathematical knowledge. Frege uses the equator, the axis of the Earth, and the center of mass of the solar system as examples of objective but non-physical entities. Bloor points out how these are just social constructions invented by people to function as structuring and ordering concepts. In the Ptolemaic system, the center of the Earth served the same role as the center of the universe, which consisted of concentric circles around the circular Earth. Bloor comments that Frege would be as horrified by sociologism as he was by psychologism. As he termed Mill's empiricist philosophy, the latter being the idea that concepts gain meaning in the individual mind, and the former in the social mind, as it were. Nevertheless, Frege's description of mathematical objectivity appears to fit the characterizations of mathematics as social construction, changeable and negotiated. As Wittgenstein puts it, if humans were not in general agreed about the color of things, if undetermined cases were not exceptional, then our concepts of color could not exist. No, our concept would not exist. This is not the place to pursue these arguments further around A and B. But I have given some indication of the direction such discussions can take. And I have given more complete account of these issues elsewhere. On private languages. In this present discussion, however, it is most important to try to answer C, since without a means of communication, teaching is certainly a wasted and futile effort. And this highlights some of the worries people express when considering C2. I will attempt to do this with reference to the concept understanding, as this is a major concern for mathematics educators, and hence will lead to the final section of the implications for mathematics education. discussions about children's understanding, how we examine and identify understanding, and ultimately what understanding means, form a central core of research in mathematics education. We talk about whether a student doing such as such would demonstrate understanding of the mathematics taught, as if there is some inner phenomena called understanding, which may be a correct understanding or an incorrect understanding, and a particular behavior on the student's part would identify which one for us. Here is the essence of the difficulty, since if all understandings are private and individual constructions, no student behavior will allow me to do anything other than make my own private constructions about what the student understands of my understanding of the concept or idea in question. The difficulty, however, may exist only in an absolutist epistemology. If addition has a transcendental existence as a concept, then the students either has that concept or not. There are no partial stages. The job of the teacher is then to discover whether the student has the correct understanding in its totality. Otherwise, it would not constitute understanding. If one abandons the absolutist epistemology, the discussion changes. Consider the familiar philosophical example. What is meant by saying that a child has learned and understand the concept hat? This come about by pointing out instances of hat objects that have the use implied by that term. When the child points to a hat and says hat, we confirm that this is correct. When the child points to a tea cozy and says hat, we have to explain that this object has a different use and it is not a hat. It is the use according to the public objective notion of hat that we can apply the word understand, and it has no application without this public connection. Of course, someone initially called eccentric and later perhaps a person who sets a new trend may put the tea cozy on their head and call it a hat, and our concept will have to undergo a public change. Wittgenstein says the following about understanding. Do I understand the word perhaps? And how do I judge whether I do? Well, something like this. I know how it's used. I can explain its use to somebody, say by describing it in made-up cases. I can describe the occasion of its use, its position in sentences, the intonation it has in speech. Of course, this only means that I understand the word, perhaps, comes to the same as I know how it's used, etc. Not that I try to call to mind its entire application in order to answer the question whether I understand the word. To summarize the shift from behaviorism to cognitive psychology, focused attention on teaching for understanding. But the problem of how to carry this out and how to identify that it had happened remain as ongoing and major ones for mathematics education. It suggests here that central to the difficulty in our notion of understanding, tied as it is to the idea of a certain and absolute concept. According to this view, the process of coming to understand a concept is one that takes place in the mind of an individual. And the final step of achieving that full understanding of a timeless, universal notion is a very private, almost mystical one. It is certainly beyond the power of any outsider, such as a teacher, to know that the process has taken place in full. The difficulty of private languages thus arises with absolutist epistemologists, not with the relativism and the present use of constructivism, C2, contrary to the usual discussions. Accepting hypothesis 1 alone, that knowledge is actively constructed by the cognizing subject, not passively received from the environment, does not ease any of our difficulties and may in fact aggravate them. On its own, this hypothesis rejects coming to know through empirical means, but leaves us with a view on knowledge that cannot be actively constructed by the individual, since knowledge is objective in the absolute sense. We need to be able to continue with our belief that if we create the right environment in the classroom, in our teaching, learning and understanding will take place. Accepting hypothesis 2, however, forces us to re-examine what is meant by knowledge and locates objectivity in the social domain, not the transcendental. Concepts are public as their meaning and so too is understanding. In the first section, the differences between intuitionists' use of the term constructivism and the present use were compared in order to clarify some of the issues in the paradigm shift in mathematics education, if that is what's taking place. In this section, I attempted to show that epistemology, mathematical knowledge, and learning theories are interdependent areas of study. Piaget's genetic epistemology was a philosophical theory resulting from his rejection of Platonism and empiricism, and it placed the question of the nature of knowledge in the study of its acquisition. Radical constructivism C2 is a re-examination of these ideas and proposes that the program has distinct consequences for mathematics education. I have attempted to support this view and illustrate it by the discussion of the notion understanding. In the final section, the issue of consequences of a theory for practice is discussed. Elsewhere, I have discussed other possible influences of alternative perspectives of the nature of mathematical knowledge on aspects of mathematics education. I have suggested that a relativist view of mathematical knowledge, and I have attempted to show that C2 is a relativist view, has implication for teaching styles, for the way the curriculum is developing in relation to problem solving and investigations. And also draws issues of social values and politics into the mathematics classroom. These are theoretical developments of consequences of C2, and theory formation is an integral part of the development of research programs. Indeed, without such theory formation, proposing consequences of hypothesis 2, in particular, radical constructivism, is perhaps vulnerable to the strong criticism of, for instance, Kilpatrick. And to attempts to subsume the innovative research in the constructivist paradigm under that of earlier ideas. Finally, there remains the question of how theory and practice relate. This is an ancient question, but again one that I suggest is a consequence of epistemologies with an absolutist teleology. The ideas developed here, taking inspiration from Wittgenstein, propose that theories and concepts are rooted in practice and obtain their meaning from use. They gain their objectivity in the public nature, in that theories written down become public property, subject to dispute, negotiation, and adaptation. Their objectivity does not lie in their being the ultimate truth. Thus, there is in general a problem of the relationship between theory and practice, but not for constructivist C2. Thereby we end the constructivist criticism of Platonism and other gestalts of mathematics, as I would say, and brings it down that language and mathematics are use, and there is a certain, so to speak, misuse of the word understanding. Understanding grows slowly, and there is no instantaneous now-like feature that, so to speak, can reveal the understanding in the pupil. You can know her or his inside, because gallantly that brings in the problem of private language from both the perspective of the pupil and the teacher. Both supposedly have some sort of private language that makes that sort of translation of the word understanding viable, possible. The Wittgensteinian take is extremely effective, I would say. One of the most strong evidence or revealment about how we often fool ourselves about language. And misuse of language I do like. It's a bad habit. It's a bad habit because it's sloppy. When I say sloppy, I mean this in the most literal sense. It's using an instrument not to the good extent. And I'm pretty sure that this is perceivable by everyone, if not always consciously. But we understand it, and people who are more skilled at the words will reveal their skill, reveal their aptitude to understand, and will be able to reach out to other people, reach out to the public, become great authors, great thinkers, politicians, leaders, managements, bosses, you name it. But if it's a scale, if you go further down, that skill is not there, just like my skill of playing football simply not is present, or a very low degree. And oddly enough, you can still play the two games. You still use the word understanding as maybe an absolutist would like to have it, as an absolute understanding. You just use it less carefully. You use it with less skill, less direction, less gusto, I would say as well. I think this is one of the most clever arguments to uncover those absolutist tendencies in everyday language. And isn't it obvious in some way using any tool, your legs, your car, a screwdriver, a hammer, the computer, an app. It's on a scale always differentiated. Why would language be a procedure of almost, as the absolutists are pointing to, 1 or 0 or a percentage, when rather it is a scale, and it's very hard to uncover how bad it is or how good it is, how elegant. I will do something of an experiment here today. I will try to parallel this with habit and conscious control, ethnography and embodiment in the Alexander technique by Gentar. In much of his work, Bourdieu's analysis of habitus is somewhat schematic. And he tends to highlight its reproductive and productive capacities rather than its adaptive ones. More recently, however, in a discussion about bodily knowledge in Pascalian meditations, he makes it clear that habitus is not always perfectly adapted and that the body itself learns. He rightly notes that this is quite different than an intellectual learning, pointing to situations where one understands with an intellectual understanding the movement to make or not to make without being able to actually do what one has understood, for lack of comprehension through the body. An important part of the habitus then is ability to learn. Up to this point, I have analyzed the practices of the technique which disrupt or transcend the habitus. Below, I will examine not only instances of disruption and transcendence, but also instances of construction of a new habitus. Although Bourdieu is right to suggest that a new habitus is always constructed from the premises of the old ones, as I discussed below, by attempting to specifically inhibit the old premises and exert conscious control over them, Alexander technique makes a particularly radical attempt to overcome these. As Bourdieu points out, ways of standing and sitting are also ways of thinking and feeling. Alexander technique is therefore not simply about re-educating the body, but changing ways of being in the world. It is here that the technique begins to shift not only ways of using and perceiving the body, but also feelings and thoughts associated with this way of being. Again, careful attention to the practices it employs can help to understand the process by which a new habitus is constructed. Throughout my fieldwork, my Alexander teacher indicated that I might find the work I was doing emotional, suggesting at one point that I might feel offended as he adjusted my shoulder, and at another that changes to the head, neck, back relationship causes many people to suffer pains or start to cry. He felt that this was quite awful to see, but part of the process. I also heard stories from interviewees about the dramatic emotional changes that might occur while studying the technique. Two teachers even know of cases where it had led to divorce, because, as one put it, how would you like to be married to a man who thought, that this was the way forward? However, despite warnings about the emotional and psychological changes which might occur as I took Alexander lessons, none of the work did seem to bring out any emotional responses or dramatic life-changing experiences. It was not until I spent a morning at a training school for Alexander teachers that I understood how the technique could elicit these types of reactions. Alexander teachers train for 3 hours per day, 5 days per week, for 30 weeks over 3 years, and therefore the time they devote to study is comparable in contact hours to studying for a degree at most British universities. It is also important to note that Alexander technique training programs are based on experience and not classroom learning. The training school I attend was held in the living room of a private home. The room contained 2 long mirrors for pupils to observe themselves, a table for what is called table work, and a model of a skeleton. A circle of chairs were arranged so that each trainee had a place to sit. The teacher trainees spent the first part of the morning practicing sitting down on the chairs and standing up again, slowly and with meticulous attention to movement and alignment. Sometimes they stood behind the chairs and put their hands on the chair back. The 2 experienced teachers who ran the school circulated between the trainees, guiding them and assisting the process for somewhere between 5 to 15 minutes each. Trainees were on mixed levels of experience, and those who were in the final year of study occasionally worked on one and another. At the encouragement of one of the teachers, 2 of them approached me and asked if they could work on me, and I agreed. They guided me in sitting and standing from the chair, an activity I've been trying to reproduce myself along with other trainees. Although I had been attending weekly lessons for 6 months at this point, I was still relatively inexperienced in the technique, and since they usually practice on other trainees, I was something of a challenge. They seemed frustrated by my inability to respond to the guidance they gave, and in turn felt frustrated by their hesitancy in directing me and the weakness of their hands as they made adjustments, which I found confusing. This experience was cut short by the announcements of a tea break held around the kitchen table, where 2 trainees read introductory statements they had been assigned to write, explaining what the technique was about, and a discussion followed. I was told that most of the time the tea break was used for reading and discussing passages of Alexander's books. Following the tea break, the group returned to the circle of chairs, working on one another in groups of 2 or 3, taking each other through the process of standing, sitting and walking. Several students took turns working on me, and one of the teachers assisted them. I was struck by the strength of the direction he was able to convey through relatively minor hands-on adjustments, particularly in comparison to the students, whose adjustments tended to be hesitant and their touch light. Finally, one student in his final year did table work with me. This was quite similar to the work done by my own Alexander teacher, except that the trainee spent a great deal of time adjusting my arms and working on my hands, making them lie flat on the table. The group broke up at noon after 3 hours of training, sitting in a coffee shop near the tube station, writing my field notes. I observed that my body felt extremely straight in a way that was quite unfamiliar, and that this was associated with feelings of discomfort and irritability, and a lingering sense that something personal, an aspect of myself, had been neutralized or stripped away. The extensive slow work of the training school, which was much longer than any of my lessons, had a significant impact on my bodily comportment, lasting a whole day before I returned to normal. Theories of the habitus are useful in making sense of this experience. Bourdieu suggests that the physical aspects of habitus, exemplified in the bodily hexes, are constitutive of the self. He defines hexes as a political mythology, realized, embodied, turned into permanent disposition, a durable way of standing, speaking, walking, and thereby of thinking and feeling. And goes on to say that what is learned by the body is not something that one has, like knowledge, that can be brandished, but something that one is. Oh, extremely interesting. If this is the case, it is not surprising that shifts in ways of comportment should be accompanied by feelings of discomfort similar to those I experienced. Indeed, of my interviewees, it was the trainee who had most recently started her training who was the clearest in expressing the difficulties she had in learning it. She described how tired she had been during her first term of study and how now, in her second term, she sometimes felt weaker than she had when she began, as muscles and patterns of muscles and tension shifted. She also mentioned that the adjustments she received were not always comfortable, and that something, this thing called gentle manipulation, gets intrusive. It invades on your old patterns, and it's quite difficult to have anyone moving you around in that way, putting you into a new place. These experiences suggest it is particularly at the beginning of such work that change and discomfort is noticed, while as immersion in Alexander technique or any other method of changing the habitus progresses, it becomes more comfortable as this work itself develops into a new habitus. Bourdieu intimates that there is a relationship between existential conditions and the body, where to be put in bodily position conjures up the state associated with that position. Merleau-Ponty provides some clarification of this when he writes of sleep. I call up the visitations of sleep by imitating the breathing and posture of the sleeper. There is a moment when sleep comes, settling on this imitation of itself, which I have been offering to it, and I succeed in becoming what I was trying to be. An unseeing and almost unthinking mass, riveted to a point in space, and the world henceforth only through the anonymous alertness of the senses. Thus, by behaving as if one is asleep, or in the case of the Alexander trainee, by taking on the posture of an Alexander teacher, one eventually becomes that which one was trying to be. Yet this becoming through bodily comportment is both cultural and habitual. Whether or not it's consciously considered, it draws upon the base of cultural knowledge and the understanding that habitual behavior brings about similar results each time it is performed. Alexander technique seeks to overcome habit. And in so doing, it obviously exemplifies a much more conscious process than sleep. However, it is also obviously cultural, circumscribed by particular behaviors and activities that form something called the Alexander technique. Further, even the process of applying conscious control to a habit by inhibiting reactions and trying not to do does eventually form habits which are in turn subjected to conscious scrutiny. Through the performance of these activities, one comes to develop a state of being in the world which is that of an Alexander pupil, or in training programs, that of a teacher. Alexander technique is transmitted from teacher to pupil through the hands, and the awareness developed by teachers is literally, to borrow Merleau-Ponty's phrase, knowledge in the hands. Yet this knowledge is not localized only in the hands, but pervades the teacher's self, which must be constantly maintained in a particular way. With good primary control and head-neck-back relationship in order to transmit the work. Amongst Alexander teachers, proximity to Alexander himself is often chartered and taken as a mark of skill. The first generation teachers who train with Alexander are highly sought after and command particular respect because of their relationship to the founder. To an outsider, this can sound like an absurd idolatry, yet when knowledge is understood to pass through the hands and to be gained not through abstract learning but through experiences, this respect begins to make more sense. Through contact with those who experience the founder's direction firsthand, one literally comes closer to Alexander himself. The work of Alexander technique is never-ending, yet lessons in the technique generally draw to a close at some point. As I have said, most teachers believe a good grasp of the work can be obtained in 30 lessons or fewer. The pupil of the technique can then go about daily life with an awareness of the basic principles of the technique, and has at this point developed new patterns of movement and alignment which are more physiologically efficient than those previously experienced. For the pupil who wishes to continue lessons or develop a very deep understanding of the technique, however, it is often thought useful to undergo Alexander teacher training. Several of my interviewees had done this in order to enhance careers in other fields, such as music, where playing an instrument had caused repetitive strain injuries. Alexander technique works by addressing patterns of bodily use through activities designed to draw attention to habit and perception. While some of what is learned becomes habitual, it will never be entirely so, and the principles of inhibition and non-doing keep the work from ever becoming unconscious. The technique is also a cultural way of attending to and with the body, as somatic mode of attention. It seeks to alter the habitus through conscious awareness of the way the self acts, and bring about change by re-educating the body/self. This is developed through the bodily learning of new ways of being in the world. In doing this, it seeks to bring about a new habitus which is under conscious control. It is this conscious control which makes Alexander technique intriguing in relation to Bourdieu's point about the teaching of bodily practices quoted above. Most physical practices are learned subconsciously and on a physical, pre-verbal level, but Alexander techniques seeks to make the process of physical learning into conscious activity where all actions are examined before being undertaken. Yet bringing action into conscious awareness does not necessarily result in the ability to document it in language. Key Alexander terms such as good use of the self and head-neck-back relationship are not in themselves adequate descriptions of what they refer to. Instead, the technique is transmitted primarily through the hands and the bodily comportment of the Alexander teacher. This transmission of bodily knowledge, communicated from body to body, has implications for our understanding of how bodies learn. The fact that what is taught in Alexander technique is always at risk of receding into unconsciousness confirms that even when shifts in bodily comportment are undertaken as a result of conscious effort, they have a tendency to become habitual. Further comments about emotional nature of the work indicates the difficulty of separating body from mind. States of the body are often states of the mind, which draw on habitual and cultural knowledge of what it is to feel a particular way or be in a particular kind of person in order to perpetuate themselves. The self worked upon in Alexander technique is located in the body and is not simply a separate mental phenomenon, a reference to the primary control of the head-neck-back relationship as a state of being in the self demonstrate. However, the emphasis on conscious awareness does indicate a kind of privileging of conscious knowledge over more habitual bodily forms of knowledge, implying that while mind-body dualism is challenged, it is not overcome. Alexander technique brings the process of bodily learning into conscious awareness, which makes it a particularly useful case study for exploring how such learning is achieved. Well, it's excellent timing here. I conclude the whole thing to say that here it's obvious that you can see how the body learns, and different way of learning are different ways of being, understanding, and in the end the very meaning of words is what we act out. It's a sort of doing things that comes to have meaning, and in the end there is a very huge relationship between Wittgenstein and Alexander. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.